Hey, everybody, this is Eric Mishi, SAVE Executive Director, Suicide Awareness, Voice of Education. And all week long, we're having conversations with individuals who are either leaders in the field related to suicide prevention, suicide loss survivors, folks who've been somehow or another impacted by suicide, all as a part of our Suicide Prevention Awareness Month efforts to raise awareness about suicide and talk about how we can all make a difference and make an impact in saving lives. And so today I'm extremely excited to be able to chat with Dr. Steve Lansing about the work that he's doing specifically in the area of veterans and veterans suicide prevention. And looking forward to this conversation. Had a chance to meet your colleague, Colonel Wayne Quist, Dr. Lansing, down in Northfield about a month or so back when we had an event there called Tour to Save, and was excited to connect with him and connect with you. So welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here and appreciate the time.
Well, so let's start out with let's tell us who you are. What's your background? What's where does this how did this issue become an issue for you?
That's always kind of an interesting question. How much of my background? I was born in 1947, and we go there. But basically, I grew up in upstate New York, only child. My dad had cancer when I was 10, and while he was alive, he was debilitated the whole time. So went through a lot, and sports was my refuge. But at 17, I broke up from the first real girlfriend, love, whatever I thought it was at the time. And my best friend has his dad was a doctor. He said, "I'll take care of your pain," and he got me a bottle of pills. And I had the bottle open, and it was that close to my mouth. And then I said, "Well, do I want to end my life for a stupid person?" And the joke is, well, if she broke up with me, she must have not been, thinking real well. But you look at that, and a lot of kids go through that today. And at 19, I joined the Air Force, went through basic training. After my training, went to first the Philippines, then spent 2 years in Vietnam. While I was there, I saw a lot of really bad stuff, and don't need to get too graphic. But along the way, a friend of mine that I was stationed with. I was standing there talking with him, drinking a few beers, and he said, "I'm tired of being here. I'm going home sooner." And he pulled a gun out and took his life right in front of me, and never got any closure on that because they sent him home, and nobody would ever talk again. When I came back in '70, it wasn't a real popular thing to be a veteran, and most people know the horror stories about that. And in 1984, went to the wall in Washington D.C., the Vietnam War Memorial, and spent the night in the middle of the night in a thunderstorm, sitting there staring at my image. I've got 5 friends that are on that wall, and that built along. In '86, I moved up to Rochester, Minnesota, as clinical director of the National Suicide Help Center. And one of the things I didn't realize at the time, but every third call I got was from a veteran. And I started looking at the numbers. And at the time, the unofficial numbers, 58,000 and change, were officially killed in the Vietnam conflict. The numbers probably double that. And that's one that the VA doesn't put out officially, but we're looking at there. About 3 years ago, and so I started working with vets. And when Desert Storm happened, I remember that was kind of part of my healing of coming back from there. I've been diagnosed with PTSD, and I started talking with more vets and seeing what was going on. And up till about 3 years ago is when I encountered Wayne, and we started collaborating together on the book that we've got out now. And that's kind of our purpose. The official number is 22 a day. Um, I think it's probably double that. It's probably more like 40 or 50. And when I was working with the Suicide Help Center, I also did a suicide survivor support group for about 3 years. I had a lady say, a couple of my friends lost children. I went to grieve together with them, and they attacked me. They said, "You don't deserve to be part of us. Your daughter chose to die. Ours didn't have a choice." And you see the same thing going on with veterans and even with PTSD. Wayne went about 56, 57 years not saying anything, because if you say something, people automatically form a bias toward what you are. I have 3 veterans right now that are in custody hearings. and the defense to take their children away is that they have PTSD as a diagnosis. And so I'm licensed to diagnose and that, but I'm very careful how I do it because I know what the impact is going to be.
Sure.
So that that started with forming this nonprofit called Veterans Empowered. Veterans Empowered is a 501c3. I'm the president of that. Wayne's secretary treasurer. We've got a board that's primarily veterans. We have a vet service officer. We have an attorney. We've got a former national director of the American Legion, and basically with the idea of opening up the awareness. Number one, having PTSD doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're crazy. It means you have a medical condition, and that came from being willing to do what others weren't. And in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual I use, PTSD and severe trauma is about the only event-based disorder that's in there. Other things can have at least some connection, but PTSD is a result of experiencing, and there's a specific criteria, but the first one is a stressor that involves facing death, near death, experiencing, witnessing death, either there directly or hearing about it, or sexual trauma. And that's a whole nother area with suicides is MST, the military sexual trauma, that also triggers into some of the suicide figures as well. So the book that you held up before, the book is basically written not as a treatment book. The first part talks about what is PTSD, and when I wrote that, I go through the criteria. There's physical changes in your brain that happen as a result of severe trauma. But the rest of the book is a history. And it doesn't just say, because when Wayne and I were working together, he said, well, what was the effect on this in people in other wars? He was in Vietnam, he was in the Middle East, and he went through a lot, experienced some really, really ugly stuff. I said, go find out. Here's your homework assignment. And as a result, we have this book now that goes back to the beginning of time. And one of the things that fascinates people, you talk about Socrates, for example. Socrates was a combat infantryman for 30 years in the Athenian army in the Peloponnesian War, fighting the Ottoman Turks. And after 30 years, wandered around the streets of Athens. And he started asking people questions. And they asked him questions back, and it became something known as the Socratic method. And the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, is that because he asked questions, the government didn't like it too much, and so they arrested him, sentenced him to death, and rather than face death, he committed suicide with hemlock. And the group now, I don't know if they're still out there, the Hemlock Society is named after that, with what happened with Socrates. So, but if you look at Shakespeare and the Bible, you look at all through history. 1980 was when PTSD became an official term in the DSM, but it goes back. You see the impact on Socrates as I see on vets that I work with today, and it's universal.
So I'm going to jump in here for a second here. So before we kind of get deeper into that, I want to talk a little bit more about what are the factors that play into the fact that veteran suicide rates are as high as they are. Our first conversation this morning was with a guy by the name of Jonathan Oppenheim, who's with a company called Willis Towers Watson that works very closely with the construction industry. Construction industry as an occupation and profession has one of the highest rates of suicide in the entire world. And so break it down for kind of the average person, right? Who's not a clinician, who may not themselves be a veteran, may know somebody who's a veteran. What are these types of factors that come into play that are so problematic for veterans in particular as it relates to suicide?
Well, I saw a presentation few weeks ago with a husband and wife team, and he's a first responder, and they have similar types of impacts, similar types of secondary trauma issues with family. But in a presentation, she said, the average person experiences 2.5 significant trauma incidents in their lifetime. And she said, for law enforcement, in the same way with vets, that's a slow month. And so the things that are experienced, the brain isn't wired for. And so what happens? There's changes in the brain structure. There's changes in coping skills. There's changes in perceptions of things like that. And if you figure putting an overcharge into electrical circuit that you short circuit, the same thing happens. The brain isn't wired to do the kinds of things that people that are in first responders or veterans fields. Seeing people die, having to take a human life, being involved in injury. I've been in 12 rocket attacks, for example. I had to pull a friend's body out of a building that took a hit that I got out, but he didn't. Um, you know, having to take a life, and there's something that's also involved in there called moral injury. And moral injury is an accelerant to PTSD that says I had to do something that goes against my wiring as a moral human being. But because that was my assignment, because that was my task, that's what I had to do. And the task you can intellectually reconcile, but the emotional impact on that, and then the factors of what that does, and especially later in life, it starts coming back. 50, 60 within there, there's something called loss, late onset stress syndrome that you start. I'm working, I'm busy, I'm doing all this other stuff. Now I've got time to start to go back and say, why did I do what I did? And what was the results of that? And they had families too, and I had to take their life, and that's what happens to that individual at a exponentially much higher rate than the average population. And so that's why, if you look at suicide rates per 100,000, which is the way they measure it, it's 14.0 for the general population, 31.7 for veterans, about 3.5 to 4 times higher, depending on what study you read.
Right. Yeah. So as you think about those statistics, right? And again, you mentioned the number of 22 veterans a day that are dying by suicide, and thinking that number is probably higher than that. Um, and this will eventually bring us back to your book and the work that you're doing and things like that. But as you think about the approach that's being taken today, whether it's kind of modern day veterans, those who've served in our most recent, wars and theaters and conflict, or you're even talking about your generation and things like that. How are things better, different, or not any different today in terms of how we address these issues related to the country's veterans?
Well, better in a way that back in 1970 or even before that, after World War II, and the two that I talk about when I give talks that are well known, um, is Audie Murphy and Jimmy Stewart. And both of them, Jimmy Stewart was a bomber commander, um, 8th Air Force. They just, were multiple. One night he had to write 130 letters to family members of people he lost. He came back, and his PTSD treatment was something called It's a Wonderful Life, because he was a well-known leading man type actor. Before he went in, came back, he was a 35 that looked 50. And that was his therapy, the intensity of what he played in there. Audie Murphy went through multiple marriages, alcoholism, suicide attempts, and eventually came out. He did his movie. You saw him in the movies. He did like 45 cowboy movies and along there. But there's also a case where after World War II, they did 1,900 lobotomies. And one was from a guy from La Crosse, Wisconsin, who passed away in 2020. And I have a video about that, to where they turned him into essentially a zombie. And that's all they knew how to do at the time. When you go back to the beginning of time, we talk about, the Civil War and the Revolutionary War and World War I and stuff. There was a lot of institutionalizing because people didn't know what else to do. Well, now we have programs. There's the programs that the VA is doing. The Legion has something that they're doing with Columbia University called Be the One, where they actually do training, and it's very similar. Back in late 70s, early 80s, I was an EMT. And I was also a CPR instructor, with the idea that you don't have a cardiologist living in your garage. This will get you till you get to that person. Well, this is the same way with what they're doing now. They're getting awareness out there, and the VA is going out and doing training. And I've co-opted with a couple with the American Legion in the past. they're getting more settings. I got this 22 a day bracelet on my wrist, which people say 22, and it was kind of funny. I'm a University of Iowa graduate from graduate school, and somebody saw the 22 and they says, "Oh, I like Caitlin Clark too. She's a great basketball player." I said, "I agree, but that's not what 22 means. That's her jersey number." But getting a chance to get people aware, and the whole idea of like what you're doing, with this month, to get people into it. Why we wrote the book was to get people to see that I'm not defective. And it's something, especially with the military, we don't get help, we give help. We're defenders, protect and serve, and all of that. And so it's much harder as a mental health professional. My field doesn't go for help as much as it should. Self-care is considered selfish, which it isn't, but that's the issue there. So chances to get out there. I'm part of a PTSD support group that meets once a month. It's been going on for 14 years with one of the vet service officers. We provide free PTSD treatment to vets. We have something through at Lutheran Social Services has a program called CORE that I'm credentialed with, that we can get some payment there. But that's what our nonprofit is about. Is the book, the therapy, everything is how can we impact this 22 a day or whatever the real number is, to cut into that. And we've been able to. Um, and I think it's making an impact. So from the better standpoint, from the other standpoint, though, there's still not enough resources. They're underutilized. I'm 1 out of 6 therapists are veterans. And I did
Hmm.
a presentation at Mental Health Center a few months ago, and I was the only vet in the room. And so getting more within there, so you understand the cultural competency of what a veteran is. So not just the suicide issue or the PTSD issue, but understanding that when you go through basic training, you go into a parallel dimension, called Militaland, for lack of a better term. And it's culturally different than any other culture you can imagine. And then you have to come back to civilian land, and what that looks like, and how do you adapt within there, and how do people understand that. And when I came back, I was triggered with thunderstorms. Sounded like the rockets hit my building one night. And people mocked me. They said it's just a thunderstorm, there's no Viet Cong in Iowa. Well, probably not, but that was kind of the impression. And my wife was one of the few people, and she was not my wife at the time, but in her family, she loved me enough that she was there. And so the support that's so necessary. I wasn't there, I can't experience it, but I can seek to understand. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do as well. It's just the overall cultural competency that then cascades into the helplessness, hopelessness that vets have, because I don't think there's any solutions. And my resources to management are less than the pain itself. And so this is the only option that I see, and working within that to make that connection. Uh,
So let's talk a little bit about the book. So it's Veterans in Crises: Treating the Unique Needs of Those Who've Served, written by you and Colonel Wayne Quist. And on the back cover here, it's by General Joseph Ralston, who is USAF retired, former Supreme Allied Commander, Europe and NATO. Says Dr. Lansing and Colonel Quist have performed a great public service by writing a book that not only speaks directly to our veterans affected by PTSD, but also to others, including family and loved ones involved with their recovery. Well done. So, talk a little bit about this book, Volume 1.
Well, the book itself, like I said earlier, it evolved out of homework assignments, and I was working with Colonel Quist around his own PTSD as a therapist, and him as my patient. And it kind of evolved from there. And if he hadn't been an Air Force career officer, he would have been a history professor. I mean, he knows stuff that most historians don't. And so he said, "What about other wars?" And so we started looking at this whole continuum of trauma, injury that people in warfare go through, and helping others understand it. So if you know where it came from, you can understand where it's going. And along the way with that, talking about families, there's secondary PTSD or secondary trauma that loved ones. We're writing, my wife and I are writing a third book. The second one comes out in November. That's a continuation. It's a kind of a prequel to this, and another book that Colonel Quist wrote. But we're writing, it's called The Blank Check. When you join the military, You sign a blank check payable to the United States of America up to and including your life, and it never goes void. What they don't talk about is that there's a cosigner. And I've had multiple, and I'm certified in a PTSD couple therapy I've got trained in last year, that my wife and I work with couples with PTSD where the secondary trauma impacts. And I've had a lot of spouses say, I knew what I was sending away. I was not prepared for what was coming back. And then you look at the differences and what do I what's just being annoying and what's a trigger. What can
Yeah.
I do if I get into a disagreement and I do something? Is that going to trigger something? And understanding what those triggers are, and having an understanding about the whole culture itself and the impact that being in that particular culture has. From the second you step off the airplane at basic training, the world changes. I mean, I learned there's 16 different uses for the F word. There's
Mhm.
some, drill sergeants and about all this, but it's for the purpose that when you get into combat, it's not a debating society. It's you have to respond quickly, and you have to do it because you're conditioned to do it, and that's the only thing that's going to save your life. And that goes back since the beginning of time. So
So,
anyway,
so with the book, and before we go further on the book, one thing I want to do is we've got a banner that's scrolling that if you're a veteran, you're watching this, you're listening to this, and you're a veteran crisis, so you need somebody to talk to, you can call or text 988, press number one.
yep.
Help is free, it's confidential, it's 24/7, 365. If you need it, use it. If you know somebody else who's a veteran who's in crisis, needs someone to talk to, make sure they talk or call, text 988. And again, hit option one. It'll bring you directly to somebody who is a trained professional, specifically trained to work with veterans who are in crises. Um, so coming back to the book, um, so when did you start writing it? When did it go to publish? And who should read this book?
Well, I could say, well, everybody, but anyone who knows someone who's been through some struggles or just better wants to understand. Everybody knows somebody who's a vet or a first responder, firefighters. And I get the same. When I worked as an EMT for about 10 years, as a part-time volunteer thing, I saw stuff as bad as I saw in Vietnam. And so that same kind of trauma happens within there. And I've talked with firefighters. So that's the issue. We started, like I say, about 3 years ago in writing this first edition. And it was a matter, we've got about 100 books in our office that were kind of the core books on this and that. But there was really nothing that looked at the history of PTSD and understanding from the beginning of history up through Ukraine. And even what's going on in Gaza right now and all of that, that beyond the acts itself, this stuff does not leave you. There's a song Charlie Daniels did years ago called Still in Saigon. And it's almost autobiographical if you're familiar with that
Mhm.
song, and it does. I sit in a restaurant with my back or my facing the door. I don't sit with my back to the door, and I back into parking spaces, and I'm hyper vigilant about what goes on, and that doesn't completely go away. And somebody says, well, that's being paranoid. And he says, yeah, paranoid saves your life unless it cripples you. But just being that hyper awareness, but understanding why that happens. And that's what we got in the book of going back and looking at Socrates and Shakespeare and up through the Civil War and World War I and World War II. And if you look at the issues with people like Jimmy Stewart, and you look at the intensity and all the movies, you had a few that were kind of comedic, but most of the movies, his westerns he did, he's a very intense kind of character, and I think that's part of his war trauma that he went through. And if you ever, there's a series they just did called Masters of the Air that talked about the 8th Air Force. It was by the same people that did Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
75% of their people were lost. Every time a B-17 went down, they had 10 crewmen on there, and not all of them made it out with parachutes or the POW camps. And so that's kind of that process, and it doesn't change. I've worked with different cultures. I've worked with different people, older, younger, people my age, and I'm 77. Um, it doesn't change. We did some training with a group of Hmong, and the Hmong were part of the secret guerrilla unit that was in Laos during Vietnam. And there's about 400 up in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And through a translator, one of the guys there, in Hmong said, "Yeah, that's me." And I was showing them the characteristic of PTSD and how it affects. Same thing. You go back and you look at Audie Murphy, you go back and you look at Socrates. It's exactly the same as what you see happening with veterans today and first responders. First responders, when I went to that talk a couple weeks ago, they were saying that husband and wife, the same exact things I heard from veterans' wives. That when that hits, when that bolt of electricity, so to speak, hits your brain, it's going to make an impact. And if you better understand that, you know, you can circumvent, being connected, being willing to understand, help me understand. I'm part of a veterans treatment court that, defers sentences with people that, the system wanted to send away. But you look at it, not what's wrong with you, but tell me what happened to you. It's called
Right.
trauma-informed care, and have been able to. And there's a Restorative Justice Act that's out there now that says if you have a diagnosis, particular one, PTSD, anxiety, um, depression fit within there, that is service connected, that if you get into legal problems and 1 and 2 are connected to the legal issue, um, you can defer the sentence. And we've had people in treatment court, veterans treatment court, because of that. And there's a 11 third judicial district, 11, 11 county treatment court. And I'm the mental health person on that and have been so since 2018. So that's some of the stuff we're doing to try to reach out to there. And then the support groups, there's something called the Invisible Wounds Project that was started by a man up in, I think, Forest Lake, or it's found by Russ, and I can't think of his last name. But anyway, it's for first responders, veterans, 911 operators, and like that. And I've helped out with a couple of those that have kind of generated down the local area. First one I set in, I could have done a diagnosis on the whole group after just check-in, just with the things that they were sharing. And as a vet, sometimes vets will talk to me where they won't talk to, to others. And that's real important too, is to not keep it buried in, because it festers and infests. And, that's where you run into the 22 a day or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
And that's what the book is about.
Okay. So we've got a couple minutes left here of our half hour. And so as we've shared information about where people can get more information at vetsempowered.org to learn more about the book and the work that you're doing. But as you are thinking, people who may have a vet in their family, someone who may be a vet themselves, someone who may work with a vet, what kind of advice would you give them in terms of how do they get resources that they need to get in order to help deal with whatever crises they're dealing with?
Well, if you go to our website, there's a resource tab on there. And one of the ones on the resource tab is something called the National Center for PTSD. And there's tons of stuff for professionals like myself, but also family members. There's training, there's cultural competence, these kinds of things. There's a few other links on there that talk about that. You can connect if you have a question that either Wayne or I can answer. There's a link on there, contact us that want to go on. If you want to get the book, it's available through Amazon right now. We're working on getting a couple other avenues to get that across. But if people need to talk or need to have kind of an understanding, go to our website, contact, I'll get back on email or whatever else like that. Go to the National Center for PTSD. Find out if veteran service officers or county employees here in Minnesota, they're a godsend, because they're all veterans. They understand and they know how the system works. But most importantly, stay connected. The opposite of hate is not love; it's connection that leads to that. And the more you can have people to stop feeling like there's some kind of freak or isolated, the more effect you're going to have to overcome this tide of suicide, or even just emotional suicide. I just check out, and there's a lot of those around there too as well.
Yeah.
So
Well, this notion of loneliness and helplessness and isolation is something that, in a world that is as connected as we are with social media and everything else, it's a reminder that nothing can replace just basic human interaction,
yeah,
caring about one another and talking to one another, reaching out and asking for help. And again, if you're a veteran in crisis or you simply need someone to talk to, call or text 988, press option 1. They'll get directed
yeah,
right to somebody who is an expert in working with veterans. It's something that's free 24/7, 365. Make sure you take advantage of it. Dr. Lansing, thank you for your time today. Thank you
My
for the
pleasure.
important working that you're doing. Thank you for your service to the country and for the service that you're continuing to do to support your fellow veterans.
And bless you for what you're doing here, and appreciate the opportunity to speak.
All right. Have a great day, Dr. Lansing. Thank you.
Thank you.